So we're back in chapter 2, and we're going to continue with the house prices that we were looking at in the first video. So if it's been a while since you did chapter 1 and chapter 2, we have some house prices from Seattle, Washington for 36 houses that we're looking at and sort of analyzing that data. So a frequency distribution is a way to group quantitative data into groups or intervals or classes, and then we can summarize how many fall into those groups or intervals or classes. So the thing is that the classes are what we call mutually exclusive. So in other words, they do not overlap. You don't want any overlapping of the classes, and they are exhaustive. And by exhaustive, we mean they cover the entire sample. So there's no data out of our 36 houses that we've sampled. There's no data that's left out when we construct our classes. So there's sort of some guidelines. Now, these aren't hard and fast, but these are guidelines for constructing a frequency distribution. Number one is how many classes we want to make. You want to make enough that it's descriptive, but not too many that there's not enough houses or data in each class. So typically they fall between 5 and 20. I mean, it's possible to have 4, but really anything less than 4, you probably don't even need a classification for, maybe 3. Again, you probably don't want to have 20 categories with only 36 items in it. So to help us try to figure out how many classes we should have and how our class width is, you kind of need to look at your overall data and kind of look at how it distributes. So again, part of this just comes with practice, and part of this just comes with looking at the data and what it represents. So we're looking at house prices, and if we look at our house prices, and again, I've flipped off the screen, but you have it there in front of you, our lowest house price is $330,000, and our highest house price is $735,000. So if you think about how we price houses, we probably want to go from maybe 300 to 800. Okay, I mean, technically you could go from 330 to 735, but that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? So we might want to say, hey, it would make sense that if we kind of were looking at houses, and I don't know if you've ever bought a house, but if you're looking at houses and you're kind of thinking how you want to break this down, maybe you want to go by the 100,000s. How many fall into each 100,000? Maybe you want to go by 50,000. It just kind of depends on your data. So one way that you can approximate the class size is to take your largest value minus your smallest value and divide that by the number of classes that you have decided. So for example, we decided to break it up into 5 classes, starting at 300 and going up to 800,000. And so when we did that, we said, all right, look, this is 800 minus 300 divided by 5. Classes means we should have $100,000 in each class, and that makes sense for our data. So then we just go through and count. It's sort of like doing tick marks. You just kind of put a tick mark in each category when you run across that data. So when we counted this, we see that we have 4 houses that fall in the 300 to 400 range. We have 11 houses that fall in the 400 to 500, 14 in the 500 to 600, 5 in the 600 to 700, and only 2 in the 700 to 800 range. So you notice that 400 is included in 2 classes, right? And 500 is included in 2 classes. Really, you want to make it where it's like 400 to 399, or 300 to 399, and 400 to 499, or something like that. Now, in this case, we didn't have any houses that were exactly on the 100,000 price mark, so it didn't matter for us. But if you did have a house that it was exactly $500, then you would need to be explicit about breaking those categories up: 300 to 399, 400 to 499, or maybe it's 301 to 400 and 401 to 500, however you want to split that up. So when we read a frequency distribution, we're going to look at what is the price range over this period of time. So our price range was 300 to 800,000. How many of those houses sold, for example, in the 500 to 600 range? So we can see that that's where the majority of the houses are in the $500 to $600,000 range. So if I'm looking for a house, or I'm a realtor who is helping someone buy a house and they're like, well, what can I expect? You can say, well, look, most of the houses fall 500 to 600 range. There's a good number that fall 400 to 500 range, but really there's only a few that fall less than 400 and not too many that fall above 600,000. So we're again kind of classifying this data, and now we have a better idea of what's out there. If we're looking for a house, or we're a realtor and we're helping someone look for a house, we have a better idea of the data of the houses that are out there, and we can help them find what they need. Now, a cumulative frequency distribution is basically adding up all of the frequencies. So here we could say, all right, well, how many houses sold for 600,000 or less? So that's the 4 in the 3 to 400 class range, the 11 in the 4 to 500 class range, and the 14 in the 5 to 600 class range. So when we add all those up, we see, all right, there was a cumulative 29 houses that were 600,000 or less. So when we talk about what we call a relative frequency distribution, this is looking at that proportion of values that fall into each class. So you would just take the class frequency divided by the number of operations. So going back to our previous data, there were 36 total observations, and I believe we had 14 observations in that 5 to 600 range. So 14 divided by 36 tells us, hey, almost 39% of houses fall in that $500,000 to $600,000 range. So again, we can look at it here. We can divide each one of the frequencies by the total. We can even convert this to a percent by either multiplying by 100 or moving the decimal 2 places to the right. So when we look at it from a cumulative relative frequency, we can say, all right, 81% of the houses cost less than $600,000. Okay. Now, one important thing to note here, and I'm going to try to see if I can draw on the slide, is that the relative frequencies have to add up to 1, and the total cumulative relative frequencies also have to add up to approximately 1. Now we may have some rounding differences, but they have to add up to 1 or 100%. And we talked about that in the last video also. So, for example, we may use the following data to answer some questions. So we could say, what percent of houses sold for at least 500,000 but not more than 600,000? Well, we can look at this and say that is 39% of houses. We could also ask ourselves, what percent of houses sold for less than 600,000? And that is 81%. So we just converted that decimal to a percent by moving the decimal place 2 places to the right. Now that's where we're going to move into the Excel. So you want to open up that Excel spreadsheet that we looked at before that was called Chapter 2. And we're going to look at, first of all, several things. I'm going to go through the PowerPoint side of it first, and then we'll jump over and look at it in Excel together. So a histogram is like a bar chart that we looked at in the first part. We may look at, or we will look at, a polygon. And then we're going to look at, be honest with you, I'm not really sure how you pronounce this word. I'm going to call it an ogive, but I don't know that that's right. If you know the correct way to pronounce that, then, shoot me an email or join me on Teams and tell me how to pronounce it, but I'm going to call it an ogive or an ogive. I don't know. Let's see. A histogram is a visual representation of the frequency or the relative frequency distribution. So the bar height indicates the frequency or the relative frequency within each class, and the width represents the class width. So we want all of our class widths to be the same, so all of the widths of our bars should also be the same. So notice here we've calculated, and we're going to look at this in just a minute in Excel. We've calculated 2 histograms. We've calculated one with the frequency and one with the relative frequency. Either way, you notice that the chart are very, very similar. The only difference is in the y-axis. So we can see that the y-axis, remember the y-axis, the vertical axis, is labeled either frequency or relative frequency. And then it's also the price. So for the relative frequency, the y-axis is the percent, or we didn't convert it to a percent here. They left it as a decimal, but you can look at that as the percent. Whereas the actual frequency is looking at it more the quantity of houses within that price range. So on the frequency, the y-axis is the quantity. On the relative frequency, that y-axis is that proportion or that percent. So when we talk about the histograms, they can either be symmetric or skewed. Symmetric means they are pretty much mirror images, meaning if you folded it in half down the middle, the left side and the right side would look exactly the same. This is what we call a normal distribution, and we'll talk about a normal distribution more in some later chapters. It's what we talk about if you've heard people talk about the normal bell curve. This is a normal bell curve. Most data in real life, not all, certainly, but a lot of data falls what we call a normal distribution, where it is rather symmetric like this. If you were to draw a graph kind of lining over it here like this, if you can see where my cursor is, that it follows sort of a bell curve. Now, some data is skewed. So when we talk about something being positively skewed, that means the tail is going to the right side. So the larger quantities are on the left side, and the tail, kind of where it tails off over here, is going to the right side. Whereas something that is negatively skewed is the opposite. So the smaller values are over here on the left side, and the larger values are up here on the right side. So positively and negatively skewed. I know those are hard to wrap our minds around, and those are something that students get confused with a lot. So you want to make sure you jot that down in your notes and make a point of that. So we're going to go in and construct a histogram in Excel. I'm going to demonstrate that for you in just a minute. Again, it's very, very similar to how we constructed the charts in the earlier video. So I'm going to get out of this and go to my Excel. So I'm going to start over here in my Excel. I've got my Chapter 2 Excel chart pulled up here. And one thing I want you to notice is I've scrolled over to the MV Houses spreadsheet. This is where we're going to start, is the MV houses. So here we have all of the house prices. This is what we've been looking at. All 36 house prices. You notice they're not sorted in any particular order. They're just in here. Now, the first thing that we want to do is go ahead and add our class limits. So you notice that's not added. We're going to add it. First thing I'm going to do is make my A column a little bit larger. So I'm going to hover my cursor over that and double click, and it makes it a little bit larger. So up here in cell B1, I'm going to add in the title class limits. Now, when we're writing our class limits, you're going to put the upper class limit. So remember, our first class went from 300 to 400, so I'm going to type in 400. And then our second class was 400 to 500, so I'm going to type in 500. 500 to 600, I'm going to put the upper limit, then 700 and 800. Now, the second thing that I want to do is I'm going to start graphing this. Now, before I do this, the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to highlight this data. I'm going to go to Insert, and then Oh, wait, I'm going to go to data. I lied to you. And now you notice over here under the Analyze tab, I have something called data analysis. If you're looking in Excel and you do not see data analysis, then you need to go add that in. So how do we add that in? We're going to go over here to File, and I'm going to go down to Options. Now, then I'm going to go over here to add-ins. Now, you'll notice that Analysis Toolpack is already under my active application add-ins. But if you don't have that showing, then it will be down here in this list of inactive application add-ins, and you would just want to select it and add it in. You don't need the one that you'll notice it says Analysis Toolpack VBA. We don't need Visual Basic for this, so you don't need to worry about that one. We just want the Analysis Toolpack like right here. So you'll click OK, and then when you do, you should see Data Analysis over here. So I'm going to click Data Analysis, and it's going to bring up a large chart, and we're going to be looking at several of these things throughout the course of the semester, but we're going to start here with histogram. So I want to click that one first and click OK. Now, I've already played with this, so my input range is going to be my house prices. So for me, that's A1, scrolling down all the way down to A37. And then I can just click this little button right here to go back. Now, the bin range, this is, I realize, odd, but the bin range is going to create your intervals. If you left this empty, blank, then you were telling Excel, create our own intervals, okay? And maybe that's something that you want to do from time to time, but rarely is Excel good at doing that. So we want to create our own intervals. We've already done that. We've listed them as class limits here in B1 to B6. So I've got those highlighted, B1 to B6, and come back. Now, here's where you can choose your output range. Where do you want to put this? I said put it in cell F1. I could change that. I could say I wanted it in E1. I could say I want it in a new worksheet or a completely new workbook. I want it to be on the same worksheet, just in cell E1. Now, I also want a chart, so I'm going to click this that says chart output right here to make sure that it gives me a chart. Now, one of the things you'll notice is that, so it automatically counts how many houses were at 400, how many are in the 500 range, 600, 700, so on and so forth. But it automatically puts a more column in there. Now, because we did our class limits correctly and they were exhaustive, and so there was no data left out, my more column is 0. So I really want to just delete this. I want to just delete that out of there. And so then I'm going to come over here to my graph, and I'm going to tell it, I just double clicked here in the plot area, and I'm going to go highlight just this data that I want and press enter. I'm going to, come on, work for me here. I'm going to tell it, you know what, I really just want you to do this data. So again, I'm going to double click here in the chart area. You can choose this filter, and here it has, notice all the categories. I don't want that more category, so I'm just going to unselect that and press apply. And now I see that that 0 category has gone away. Now, the other thing that I want to do to make this really look more like a histogram is I really want to make these bars wider and reduce the width in between. So if you notice, I just clicked on the actual bar itself, and it opened up a menu over here to the right. And I'm going to go to gap width. It's currently set to 150%, and I'm going to make that 0. So now there's no width at all. Maybe I want to make it 5%. So now it gives me just a little bit of width. But you can see that now. So that looks more like what we saw in the chart, in the textbook and in the PowerPoint slides. Now, this is when I'm calculating a frequency distribution. Excuse me. If I wanted a cumulative frequency distribution, Or let's say that I don't have the raw data for the house prices. Let's say that I just have this data right here. Then instead of calculating a frequency distribution, I would do just a 2D column chart. So I'm going to change worksheets over here and go to MV frequency. And so here we're given the same data, notice, but instead of being given all the raw data, they've already gone ahead and put it in the classes for us. This is just all we were given. So here I can come in and just highlight this data. I'm going to go to Insert. I'm going to go over here to my charts. I'm going to go ahead and jump up here to the column or bar chart. I want a 2D column chart. This is exactly the same chart that we made in the video, in the first video, and I'm going to add that in. So now I can come in, I can add my chart title if I want to. Let's see, what do I want to call it? House prices. I'm going to go in and change the width again. I can right click, so I just right clicked on the bar and I'm going to go to Format Data Series, and now again I can change that width. I like to make it just a little bit, maybe 5% there. I can add in my data labels. We click this plus button up here. I can put in axis titles. I could put in data labels if I wanted to. I'm going to put in some axis titles. So over here on the left axis, I'm going to call this frequency. And down here in the bottom axis, the x-axis, I'm going to call this house prices. And then I may say in 1000s, because we've cut the zeros off the end just to make it a little neater and easier to see. And so now I've created another histogram again, but I've done it by using a 2D chart instead of using the histogram data analysis tool pack. So let's jump back to our PowerPoint for just a minute. Now, another thing that we may want to do is calculate what's called a polygon. And a polygon is a visual representation of, again, the frequency or the relative frequency. It's more like, think of it as a line graph as opposed to a bar chart. So if we look here, this is an example of the polygon. It appears to be bell-shaped, so our data was fairly symmetrical, not exactly, but we're graphing this sort of like if it were a parabola, if you remember that from math. So let's jump back to our Excel spreadsheet now, and I'm going to scroll over and find the worksheet called Polygon. So once again, I've got my worksheet called Polygon. I'm going to come over here and highlight my data. I'm going to go to Insert. Now for my charts, this time I want to do the Insert Scatter or Bubble chart. So this one falls right above that chart data. Again, you can always go to Recommended Charts and then All Charts and find it that way. Now, the one that I want to use is, and you can look at them here, I'm going to choose to use this one that's called Scatter with Straight Lines and Markers. So you could use some of the different ones and you can play around with these, but we're going to use the Scatter with Straight Lines and Markers. And here again, it gives us that parabola for us. We can change the chart title if we like. We can add in those data labels and those axes labels if we would like to. Again, very easy. We always want to label our axis, so we could label our axis title for our x-axis as house prices. We're going to label our y-axis as relative frequency. And then we could name our chart title Seattle House Prices, or whatever we want to make it. And again, I want to point out, you have this menu that pops up over here to the right that gives you a lot of options. So we could change the color of it. Right now it's blue. Maybe I want to make it be red. I could change the line. I could take out the line. I could make it a solid line. I could make it a thicker line if I want to. I have lots and lots and lots of options over here. I can change the marker color. Maybe I want the marker color to be purple. I don't know. I can change lots of different things to make my graph be visually what I want it to be. Now, the last thing that we're going to jump over here and look at, I'm going to jump back to the PowerPoints for a minute, is that Ogive or Ogive, which is the visual representation of the cumulative frequency or the cumulative relative frequency. So the key here is that it's not going to make that bell shape, because as a cumulative, it's just going to get larger and larger. So we're not going to make that bell shape. We're just going to represent how fast it's growing. So here's an example of looking at that one. We're going to make it in Excel in just a minute. But here we can see the cumulative relative frequency of the house prices. And notice our chart looks almost kind of S-shaped. So when we jump back into Excel, I'm going to go just a couple of spreadsheets to the left to the Ogive spreadsheet. And again, I'm going to highlight my data here. I'm going to go to Insert. I'm going to go back here to my charts. I'm going to do the same chart, the scatter with straight lines and markers. But notice the difference is that this one is never going to come back down. It's never going to come back down because it's the cumulative frequency. Okay, so it's never going to get smaller. The cumulative frequency only gets larger and larger. And again, we can go in and mess with the line color. We can add our titles. We can add our axis labels. All of those are very important. So one thing that I want to make sure that you know from this section of the notes is when you use each chart. So the Ogive is for the cumulative frequencies or relative frequencies, whereas the Polygon is for the frequency or relative frequency. The histogram is when you have the raw data. You're going to use the 2D column chart when you're just given the class data. So important for you to know all of those pieces and when they're used.